The wind dropped, and the air was made stifling as the earth released the heat it had absorbed all day. We drank from our canteens until our bellies bulged and tried to move as little as possible. Sweat ran down our sides and faces. The dust clinging to our skin thickened into a gummy film. Temperatures were irrelevant. The climate in Indochina does not lend itself to conventional standards of measurement. The mercury level might be 98 degrees one day, 110 the next, and 105 the day after that, but these numbers can no more express the intensity of that heat than the reading on a barometer can express the destructive power of a typhoon. The only valid measurement was what the heat could do to a man, and what it could do to him was simple enough. It could kill him, bake his brains, or wring the sweat out of him until he dropped from exhaustion. The pilots and the mechanics on the base could escape to their cool barracks or air-conditioned clubs, but on the perimeter there was nothing you could do about the heat except endure it. Relief came only at night, and the night always brought swarms of malarial mosquitoes and the crack, crack, crack of the sniper rifles. After I came home from the war, I was often asked how it felt going into combat for the first time. I never answered truthfully, afraid that people would think of me as some sort of war lover. The truth is, I felt happy. The nervousness had left me the moment I got into the helicopter, and I felt happier than I'd ever had. I don't know why. I had an uncle who had told me what the fighting had been like on Iwo Jima, an older cousin who had fought with Patton in France and who could hardly talk about the things he had seen. I had read all the serious books to come out of the World Wars and Wilfred Owen's poetry about the Western Front, and yet I had learned nothing. All the poet can do today is warn, Owen wrote. Colby and the other platoon sergeants were certainly not poets, but that is what they had been trying to do the night before. Warn me, warn all of us. They had already been where we were going, to that frontier between life and death, but none of us wanted to listen to them. So I guess every generation is doomed to fight its war, to endure the same old experiences, suffer the loss of the same old illusions, and learn the same old lessons on its own. The trail was narrow and muddy. Even in the dry season, nothing ever dried in the bush. It only became less wet. A maze of bamboo and elephant grass, twice the height of a man, grew on one side of the trail, and on the other side there was the sluggish river, and west of the river the mountains. The saw-edged grass slashed our skin, sweat made the scratches sting, and the heat pounded against our helmets and wrung the sweat out of us as we might wring water from a sponge. There were moments when I could not think of it as heat, that is, as a condition of weather. Rather, it seemed to be a thing malevolent and alive. We kept walking slowly with the high green wall of the mountains looming above us. That was about all I could eat. Christ, I'd never felt so exhausted, and yet I had walked only 3 miles, less than 1/10 of the distances I had marched at Quantico. It must have been the heat, the incredible Southeast Asian heat. Looking through the door at the white glare outside, I wondered how this sun could be the same one now shining gently in the cool Midwestern spring back home. It's interesting how the color green, which poets and songwriters always associate with youth and hope, can be so depressing when there's no other color to contrast with it. Green. It's embedded in my consciousness. My vision is filled with green rice paddies, green hills, green mountains, green uniforms, light green, medium green, dark green, olive green. It's as monotonous as Gordon's voice. To get away from Gordon, I go check the perimeter. The Marines are all in the same state of mind as I, fed up, fucked up, and far from home. Their arms are tanned with a deep brown, but the heat has bled the color from their faces, and their eyes have that blank expression known as the 1,000-yard stare. The flight was a short one and took us over a part of the enemy's range. The manuals we had used in guerrilla warfare courses cheerfully stated that the modern civilized soldier should not be afraid of the jungle. The jungle can be your friend as well as your enemy. Looking at the green immensity below, I could only conclude that those manuals had been written by men whose idea of the jungle was the Everglades National Park. There was nothing friendly about the Vietnamese bush. It was one of the last of the dark regions on Earth, and only the very brave or the very dull, the two often went together, could look at it without feeling fear. The column started to bunch up, and the NCOs passed the word to keep it spread out, people, 5 paces between each man. It was a phenomenon I'd seen before. In the jungle, men tended to draw together, seeking the reassurance that comes from being physically close to one another, even though that increased the risk of the proverbial one round killing several men at once. I think this bunching happened because even the illusion of being alone in that haunted, dangerous wilderness was unbearable. We were supposed to know better, but officers were as prey to this fear as men. The stream bed grew deeper, its banks rising several feet above our heads. A gray-green twilight filtered through the jungle canopy. Plant life grew in snarled profusion along both banks. Tree branches, vines, and tendrils were locked together, trying to strangle each other in a struggle to climb out of the shadows and reach the sunlight. Water oozed from the sides of the ravine, and the dead air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and leaves. It seemed as though we were walking through a sewer. And the mutilation caused by modern weapons came as a shock. We were accustomed to seeing the human body intact. To us, a corpse was an elderly uncle lying in a coffin, his face powdered and his tie in place. Death admits to no degrees. The elderly uncle who dies decently in bed is no less dead than the enemy soldier whose head has been blown apart by a .45 caliber bullet. Nevertheless, we were sickened by the torn flesh, the viscera, and splattered brains. The horror lay in the recognition that the body, which is supposed to be the earthly home of an immortal soul, which people spend so much time feeding, conditioning, and beautifying, is in fact only a fragile case stuffed full of disgusting matter. Even the brain, the wondrous, complex organ that generates the power of thought and speech, is nothing more than a lump of slick gray tissue. The sight of mutilation did more than cause me physical revulsion. It burst the religious myths of my Catholic childhood. I could not look at those men and still believe their souls had, quote-unquote, passed on to another existence, or that they had had souls in the first place. I could not believe those bloody messes would be capable of a resurrection on the last day. They did, in fact, seem more dead. Massacred or annihilated might better describe what had happened to them. Whatever, they were gone for good, body, mind, and spirit. They had seen their last day, and not much of it either. They died well before noon. On the afternoon of the 4th day, we passed through Geo Tree, the hamlet 3rd Platoon had destroyed earlier. A few villagers were still there, searching for their belongings among the mounds of ashes and charred skeletons of their homes. One old man shuffled along, carrying a partially burned pot. He and the others, there were about 6 altogether, stopped to look at us as we marched by. I can still see them, dressed in ragged cotton clothes, standing against a background of rubble and blackened trees, watching us with a passivity that was not submission. A sense of guilt and compassion came over me at first. Burning their hamlet had been a demonstration of the worst in us, and I would have been grateful for a chance to show the best that was in us. Instinctively, I wanted to do something for them because of what we had done to them. We could not have done much, except perhaps give them our food and cigarettes. I would have gladly done that, emptied my pockets and pack, and ordered my platoon to empty theirs, but the villagers' stony coolness inhibited me. They did not seem to want us to do anything. They just stood there, silent and still, showing neither grief nor anger nor fear. Their flat, steady gazes had the same indifference I had seen in the eyes of the woman whose house I had searched in Hoi Vuk. It was as if they regarded the obliteration of their village as a natural disaster, and accepting it as part of their lot, felt no more towards us than they might feel towards a flood. Such passivity struck me as inhuman. It might have been a stoical mask, concealing deep feelings of sorrow or rage, but if that was the case, their ability to control their emotions was just as inhuman. In this way, my pity for them rapidly turned into contempt. They did not behave the way I expected them to behave. That is, the way Americans would under similar circumstances. Americans would have done something, glared angrily, shaken their fists, wept, run away, demanded compensation. These villagers did nothing, and I despised them for it. Their apparent indifference towards what had happened made me indifferent. Why feel compassion for people who seem to feel nothing for themselves? For I had no conception of the ordeal that constituted their daily existence. Confronted by disease, bad harvests, and above all by the random violence of endless war, they had acquired a capacity to accept what we would have found unacceptable, to suffer what we would have considered insufferable. Their survival demanded this of them. Like the great Annamese mountains, they endured. There was no heavy fighting around Da Nang for the rest of the summer. During the daytime, there did not seem to be any war at all. The rice paddies lay quietly in the sun. They were beautiful at that time of year, a bright green dappled with the darker green of the palm groves shading the villages. The peasants in the villages in the secure areas went on living lives whose ancient rhythms had hardly been disturbed by the war. In the early morning, small boys led the water buffalo from their pens to the river wallows, and farmers came out to till the fields. They plodded for hours behind wooden ox-drawn plows, tilling the sun-baked hardness out of the earth. In the afternoons, when it became too hot to work, they quit the fields and returned to the cool dimness of their thatched huts. It was like a ritual. When the heat got too intense, they unhitched their plows and filed down the dikes towards their villages, their conical hats yellow against the green of the paddies. A wind usually sprang up in the afternoon, and in it the long shoots of maturing rice made a luxuriant rippling. It was a pleasant sight, that expanse of jade-colored rice, stretching out as far as the foothills and the mountains blue in the distance. At dusk, the buffaloes were driven back to the pens, with the small boys walking beside them and whacking their haunches with bamboo sticks. They came down the dusty roads, their horned heads swaying and their flanks caked with the mud of the wallows. Everything rotted and corroded quickly over there. Bodies, boot leather, canvas, metal, morals. Scorched by the earth, racked by the wind and rain of the monsoon, fighting in alien swamps and jungles, our humanity rubbed off us as the protective bluing rubbed off the barrels of our rifles. We were fighting in the cruelest kind of conflict, a people's war. It was no orderly campaign, as in Europe, but a war for survival waged in a wilderness without rules or laws, a war in which each soldier fought for his own life and the lives of the men beside him, not caring who he killed in that personal cause or how many or in what manner, and feeling only contempt for those who sought to impose on his savage struggle the mincing distinctions of civilized warfare, the code of battlefield ethics that attempted to humanize an essentially inhuman war. According to those quote-unquote rules of engagement, it was morally right to shoot at an unarmed Vietnamese who was running, but wrong to shoot one who was standing or walking. It was wrong to shoot at an enemy prisoner at close range, but right for a sniper at long range to kill an enemy soldier who was no more able than a prisoner to defend himself. It was wrong for an infantryman to destroy a village with white phosphorus grenades, but right for a fighter pilot to drop napalm on it. Ethics seemed to be a matter of distance and technology. You could never go wrong if you killed people at long range with sophisticated weapons. And then there was that inspiring order issued by General Greene, kill VC. In the patriotic fervor of the Kennedy years, we had asked, what can we do for our country? And our country answered, kill VC. That was the strategy, the best our best military minds could come up with. Organized butchery. Organized or not, butchery was butchery. So who was to speak of rules and ethics in a war that had none? In the middle of November, at my own request, I was transferred to a line company in the 1st Battalion. My convictions about the war had eroded almost to nothing. I had no illusions, but I had volunteered for a line company anyway. There were a number of reasons, of which the paramount was boredom. There was nothing for me to do but count casualties. I felt useless and a little guilty about living in relative safety while other men risked their lives. I cannot deny that the front still held a fascination for me. The wrongs or rights of war aside, there was a magnetism about combat. You seemed to live more intensely under fire. Every sense was sharper. The mind worked clearer and faster. Perhaps it was the tension of opposites that made it so, an attraction balanced by revulsion, hope that warred with dread. You found yourself on a precarious emotional edge, experiencing a headiness that no drink or drug could match. Waiting for the wine, I looked at the Frenchman talking, gesturing, and laughing at some joke or other, and I began to feel lightheaded. It had something to do with the relaxed manner of those men, with their laughter and the sound of their forks made against the plates. The wine heightened the sensation. Later, after finishing the Chateaubriand and a half the bottle of red wine, I realized what the feeling was: normality. I had had